Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Mark Golding, Minister of Health and Wellness, Dr. Christopher Tufton, former Prime Minister, the Most Honorable Percival James Patterson, former Prime Minister, the Honorable Orette Bruce Golding, former Leader of the Opposition, Dr. the Honorable Peter Phillips, Vice Chancellor, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, Pro-Vice Chancellor and Principal, Professor Denzel A. Williams, keynote speaker, the Right Honorable Jeremy Corbyn, and wife, Ms. Laura Alvarez, Opposition Senator, Mr. Peter Bunting, members of the Manley family, members of the UWI Mona Executive and Senior Management, UWI Mona Deans and Heads of Department, Conference Chair, Professor Anthony Bogues, staff and members of the UWI Mona community, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, good evening. I could see that hearts are overflowing. I could tell from just the greetings that I saw so many of you give to each other. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the opening ceremony of this inaugural Caribbean Prime Ministers Conference, which will be honoring the centennial of the Honorable Michael Manley, the iconic two-time Prime Minister of Jamaica, born December 10, 1924. He served as Jamaica's fourth and sixth Prime Minister, 1972 to 1980 and 1989 to 1992. And he was a significant figure in Caribbean politics and global diplomacy during the 20th century. He was a polyvalent personality, and the conference promises to commemorate his legacy. To all of you who are visiting for the conference, I trust that you are already enjoying the warm Mona hospitality. I saw some of that on display. I am seeing a lot of wonderful friends and persons I haven't seen in quite some time. Welcome. And let me also welcome all who are viewing on UWITV, because we are streaming live. My name is Heather Ricketts, and I am deeply honored to chair this opening ceremony. I want to apologize for the Vice Chancellor, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, who is our conference sponsor. He regrets that he's unable to join us this evening as he's away on university business. Ladies and gentlemen, when Professor Tony Bogues, as we refer to him, Tony, Professor of Africana Studies and Director of the Ruth J. Simmons Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown University, when he approached the Vice Chancellor, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, to have the UWI collaborate with Brown University on this Caribbean Prime Ministers Conference, beginning with the Michael Manley Centennial, there was immediate acceptance. Jamaica being the home of Michael Manley, the Vice Chancellor turned to the Mona campus. Principal Williams was tasked with ensuring that the collaboration took place, and the Faculty of Social Sciences that has studied, taught, and researched Manley's work and continues to do so was delegated the job of working with Professor Bogues and establishing a planning committee. We thank the Vice Chancellor for his sponsorship, the Watson Institute of International Affairs at Brown University, the P.J. Patterson Institute of Africa Caribbean Advocacy, the Ruth J. Simmons Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice, and the Faculty of Social Sciences, Mona, for the tremendous partnership that has culminated in this conference, beginning now with the opening ceremony. We can all agree that beyond culture, art, and sport, the Caribbean has produced some major political figures who have had international reach. Prime Minister Michael Manley was one such prime minister, and others we may note include Eric Williams of Trinidad and Tobago, Fidel Castro of Cuba, and Maurice Bishop from Grenada. I must advise you that we will have forthcoming Prime Ministers' conferences, and these will continue the honoring of the legacies of other Caribbean Prime Ministers. Prime Minister Manley's first term in office was during the period of decolonization. His was the task of making the independence dream seem very possible to the average and ordinary Jamaican through what former Vice Chancellor Nettleford terms the smadification process, which by extension meant a fight for social justice and equity. Jamaica, as you would imagine then, was rigidly stratified, with an education system that provided a tiered quality of schooling based on social class, a society with high levels of illiteracy and innumeracy, and children who were born outside of wedlock virtually relegated to invisibility and non-personhood, among other social ills and realities. Through new legislation, through social policy and social programs, and the establishment of institutions, Manley set about the process of decolonization. The Jamal, the Jamaica Movement for the Advancement of Literacy, and the NHT, the National Housing Trust, for example, were established to tackle adult illiteracy and limited access to housing, respectively. The Children's Act granted equal status to children born outside of marriage as those born within marriage. And free secondary education sought to tackle the problems of limited access to schooling beyond the primary level. I single these out rather self-servingly because of my own disciplinary interests in sociology and social policy. Of course, Manley is known for far more other things, such as democratic socialism and the establishment of the new international economic order, which those who are more versed in these areas of his life will discuss and debate over the next 2 days. It is my pleasure now to invite the recorded remarks from our Vice Chancellor and conference sponsor, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles.
For me, it's a great honor and joy to participate in our university's celebration of two great Caribbean men who came within our community at the same moment in history, 1924. And this year we celebrate, therefore, the life and the contributions of Sir Frank Worrell and Michael Manley. Sir Frank was born on the 1st of August 2024 and Michael Manley on the 10th of December 2024. They were shipmates within Caribbean history. When our university was born in 1948, both men were already well known for their political and philosophical views about Caribbean development. Both men were 24 years old. In 1962, that partnership continued. That bonding of these two great men continued. As Jamaica became an independent nation, both men were in that inaugural entry into the Senate of Jamaica. Frank Worrell, invited by Prime Minister Bustamante to sit as a JLP senator, while Michael Manley, in the same induction ceremony, served as senator for the PNP. To remember these two men, therefore, is also to celebrate the first 50 years of the University of the West Indies. In every regard, both men were children of the 1930s workers' revolution. As we know, from the early 1930s through to the end of the decade, the workers of this region, the intellectuals of this region, the progressive professional classes of this region took a stand against colonialism, demanding social justice, demanding racial equality, and the projection of sovereignty. Michael Manley was a son of the Jamaican middle class. Frank Worrell was a son of the Barbados working class. But they both met in Jamaica when Frank Worrell decided that Jamaica was the place for him to develop his consciousness agenda, because he found Barbados, the home of the plantation culture, a bit too oppressive for his expectations. In Jamaica, he met with Michael Manley, two young men in their 20s, and began their partnership. Frank Worrell died here at the Mona campus in the University Hospital on the 13th of March, 1967. He was 42 years old. In a way, he had passed on his tremendous baton to Michael Manley. Worrell had fought for his entire life for the dignity of black people to be treated fairly and equitably. He had fought against a colonial economic system that said political leadership should reside ideally in the hands of the propertied classes. This is what Frank Worrell fought for: the principle of merit, the political philosophy of democracy, to ensure that equal treatment was necessary for equal citizenship. And so we see in the passing of Worrell, Michael Manley getting into stride around these concepts, these philosophical positions, these notions of governance, of citizenship. In a way, Walter Rodney, who had intervened in the discourse of leadership within the region and the university, had laid the foundation for the application of the Worrell principle to all areas of social existence, to recognize one's African ancestry, to recognize the injustice against African people, and to call for reform, to call for restructuring, and to call for the liberation of all of our people within a democratic ethos. There is no doubt that these became the foundation principles of the politics of Michael Manley in much the same way that they were aggressively the politics of Frank Worrell. They were friends. They were lovers of cricket. They were lovers of justice and the notion that all citizens ought to be given an equal opportunity. We may therefore say, within our academic discourse, we may therefore say that there is something we could call the Worrell-Manley Revolution, based on the principle of giving support and liberation and equality for the poor. Both Worrell and Manley were university men. Worrell taking the opportunity in 1948 when the UWI was established, but while he was a professional cricketer, to enroll at the University of Manchester to pursue his degree in the social sciences. Michael Manley was a supporter of the University of the West Indies, as was Frank Worrell. They both believe in the transformative role and contribution of this university. They both became philosophically embedded in the affairs of this university. The UWI meant a great deal to both men. Michael Manley was quintessentially a scholar, a researcher, and a writer. He was in every way possessed of a professorial mind and mentality. Frank Worrell was an activist. He believed in the practice of excellence, the pursuit of equity in all areas of social existence. And he did not support, in fact, he fought against the principle that colonial governance was about relating to the authority of the empowered corporate classes. Both men called for a governance model that allowed for all citizens to have equal access to leadership, to governance within the context of social justice and political democracy. Both men believe in the power of higher education to build a modern society and a modern economy. Both men accepted the principle that a university well led would be a liberation institution in this regard. It is therefore not surprising that both men, at the end of their professional careers, came home to the UWI. Frank Worrell, in 1962, returning from Australia, triumphant, accepted a position of warden of a campus dormitory here at Mona, working to enshrine that sense of progress and excellence within the student body. He believed in the UWI. Michael Manley, likewise, sought office within the UWI, this Mona campus, where he was determined to spend time with his intellectual peers in conversation, in writing. And so the UWI became the home of these two great Caribbean stalwarts. It is only fitting, therefore, that this university, having been recognized as a home and as an ally in their struggles for justice and democracy, that the university now, on reflection, on their centennial year, it is only fitting and honorable, therefore, that our university should salute these two extraordinary intellectual energy sources that have done so much for this country and this region and the world beyond. The university, therefore, with a sense of pride and dignity, celebrates, therefore, the life and the times of Sir Frank Worrell and the Honorable Michael Manley. Thank you.
We thank the Vice Chancellor. We could always rely on the Vice Chancellor for locating every event historically, and the beautiful weaving of the Honorable Michael Manley's life with that of Frank Worrell is something which I'm not sure many of us had actually paid attention to. Let's give the Vice Chancellor another round of applause, please. I know that we are competing a bit with the birds who have gone home to roost. That event takes place as well in the Faculty of Social Sciences in the car park in the evenings, and it's really a sight to behold. So I am, I am pleased now to invite our Mona Campus Principal, Professor Denzel Williams, to bring his greetings and his remarks.
Thank you very much, Dean Ricketts. Let me recognize the distinguished speaker, Ms. Honorable Jeremy Corbyn. May also recognize Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Mark Golding. Let me recognize Dr. the Honorable Christopher Tufton, Minister of Health, and an academic at heart. So I'm pretty sure that you're pleased to be at this important conference, sir. Let me also recognize our distinguished chair, Professor Bogues, and the entire team from the Faculty of Social Sciences. I'd also like to recognize Senators Motley and Morris and other distinguished ladies and gentlemen who have joined us this evening. Professor Bogues, I'm not sure that fate would have it that you asked for the opening ceremony to be on the 3rd of December, because on the 4th of December, I'm not sure that Honorable Jeremy Corbyn at this time would be able to deliver his remarks very well after an event that will take place in London tomorrow evening at this time, and that's Arsenal versus Man United. So, you're very confident. Okay. Well, volume. Okay, so we hope that you're in good spirits after tomorrow. But ladies and gentlemen, let me, like our Vice Chancellor, really say how pleased I am and the entire Mona campus to participate in this important event celebrating the life and work of our former Prime Minister, Michael Manley. But like Vice Chancellor Beckles, I would like to make a few comments in situating and contextualizing the discourses that will be happening over the next few days. But when Professor Bogues and team came to us to say we are approaching the centennial of a number of Caribbean leaders and we should really celebrate their work, and we would start with Michael Manley, given the closeness of his centennial, we did not hesitate. We fully embraced the concept because we think as a university, these are things that we should actually be advocating for. And so we are happy that as we look to celebrate Michael Manley's 100th birthday, we try to better understand the work of this important figure and also why he did what he did. But for me, out of those 11 years, the important number, Dr. Tufton, is 11. And 11 is important because that really captures the period in which Michael Manley had the privilege of leading Jamaica, a small city-state that was just emerging from the cleavages of plantation slavery and British colonialism. Those characteristics matter because this is a contextual framework that guided Manley's operationalization of his leadership of Jamaica during his time. To better understand Manley, who he was, and what he did, that contextual framework has to be taken into consideration when we're analyzing his broad policy frameworks, the institutional environment within which he did what he did, and the broad governance structures which emerged from his leadership. There are so many facets of Manley's multi-textured and multi-layered leadership that I am sure over the next 2 days, the conference will critically analyze and try to extract lessons that are applicable to Jamaica in today's inhospitable global capitalist system, where microstates are struggling to reduce economic and social inequalities so that their citizens can lead a better life. However, there is one area of Manley's work that stands out for me and which places like Jamaica are still trying to grapple with as it charts its course towards true nation building, where all citizens can reap the rewards of macroeconomic gains and not just a privileged few. And that area, ladies and gentlemen, is the call for a new international economic order. The call for NIEO was relevant in the 1970s as it is today, especially for small states like Jamaica, which cannot escape the interaction with the global economy in order to survive. Our internal markets are too small for us to gain economies of scale and scope in order to drive efficiencies in our production and distribution systems to create real wealth. As such, we have to look to the international markets for long and sustainable growth. But that market is not tolerant to uncompetitive offerings, so microstates will have to improve their competitiveness in order to be able to compete globally and win. Therefore, the imbalance of technological innovation between the North and the South has to be addressed in not only a paternalistic way, but in a way that leads to true development for the South. It therefore means that aid which comes to the South from the North should be directed at helping the South to build institutions that drive competitiveness and not just for humanitarian support, and also not to allow the multiplier effects of these aid to stay in the North through tied conditionalities. It should not be aid for dependency, but aid for growth. So, whatever the institutional support that we gain from the North, investments must be made in education, in research and development to build globally competitive human capital, which is in essence what the call for the new international economic order was about. It was not about mendicancy. This is what the conceptual framework that the NIEO was trying to advocate through Michael Manley, which was relevant then and is even more relevant today. There's still this gap between the North and the South in terms of technological advancement. And so the South will remain in a state of low wage, low growth, and low technological dependency if we do not correct these uncompetitive situations. So for us to be truly economic independent, we have to escape the unholy trinity of low wage, low growth, and low technology trap. It is therefore why the NIEO is so important, because the call for the NIEO was to really rebalance the technological divide. So as the conference proceeds over the next few days, I encourage all of you who are participating to pay close attention to how Manly's ideas can help to shape a more hospitable world, especially for microstates like Jamaica. I would like to say once again, thanks to Professor Bogues and the entire leadership team from the social sciences, the Vice Chancellery, the Mona campus executives, who have worked very hard to put this conference together. I expect the deliberations over the next 2 days to be sharp, intellectually rich, but most importantly, practical in their solutions. Ladies and gentlemen, as we conference to celebrate Michael Manley, recall the word is always love. Thank you.
Thank you very much again, Principal. And I could see your lenses of international business and economics certainly brought to bear on the work of Michael Manley. And just from scanning the program, I am sure that the issue of the new international economic order will be one of the items discussed. Thank you once again. Ladies and gentlemen, we are very honored to have joining us to give some reflections, a granddaughter of the late Michael Manley. And so let us welcome Ms. Rhea Manley.
Former Prime Minister, Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Mark Golding, the Honorable Jeremy Corbyn, Dr. the Honorable Christopher Tufton, Minister of Health and Wellness, Professor Denzel Williams, Dr. Heather Ricketts, Professor Anthony Tony Bogues, distinguished guests and visitors, good evening. My family and I would first like to express gratitude to the UWI Faculty of Social Sciences, the P.J. Patterson Institute for Pan-Africa-Caribbean Advocacy, and the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs at Brown University. We are all very grateful to all involved in planning and executing this conference, and pleased to once again celebrate my grandfather's legacy with Tony after the gripping lecture he organized at my grandfather's alma mater, the London School of Economics, where my aunt and uncle shared remarks. We appreciate, too, that you have brought the conversation home to the UWI, which will now house significant Michael Manley artifacts and papers for contemporary and future scholars to work with. We're truly heartened by these events, which honor the legacy of the work he started, which is so important to be expanded on and continued today. I'd like to open my reflection with the most vivid personal memory I have with my grandfather, who would have balked at being addressed in that way, as he asked us not to call him Grandpa, but Max. But I was about 6 for this visit. The first tooth I would lose was wobbling, and I was anxious, probably because everybody around me was. He was not well at this point. Everything he said is a blur, except when he asked whether I would leave my tooth with him when I twisted it out of my mouth. I had heard about the tooth fairy, and I was expecting to trade what had filled the new gap in my mouth for hard cash. He offered a fair exchange, but I told him it wouldn't be the same. He looked at my parents, winked, and said he would get it to her, and I would be paid twice for the tooth. Union for the fair trade of teeth. I come to you humbly quilting lore around my now contextualized child-sized Capezio leotard and I Love Cape Town dress, tokens he brought from trips. As for most of his large life, I wasn't there. Nevertheless, memory is a curious thing and can create connections in curious ways. I've been fortunate to grow up hearing stories about him from my loved ones, to meet him through the people he may have sent a personal note to about a shared hobby he managed to have time for, such as horticulture or sports or the arts, people he worked closely with in government, and people who he never met, who have very passionate feelings about the effect he had on their life. Having our surname and moving around in Jamaica means casual and professional introductions can be peppered with any relation in varying tones, followed either by awe or contempt. Attempts to decontextualize ourselves have proven futile, as Max was not parochial in his crusade against injustice. I have gotten the question in Portland, Oregon, Savannah, Lamar, and Port of Spain. My grandfather created shocks and waves through Jamaica and the world with his public endeavors, which were motivated by his unyielding determination to achieve social justice, illustrated in his youth when he opted to leave Jamaica College rather than accepting a caning from his headmaster. Norman Gervin astutely observed that his response may have been engendered from his socialization at home, where notions of Jamaica as an independent nation with a need for its own identity were stirring from Norman and Edna. I feel that he continued this with his children. They say that it was never the case that he tried to mold them into his worldview, but that they, and by extension their descendants, are rooted and grounded in it as a family, almost as though it's in our DNA. Through growing in the example of it and seeing firsthand from the inside how he showed us all in that quote of his that we also know so well that the word is. I see it live on in brave spaces where people feel moved and move with conviction. The world has entered an epoch of emboldened imperial might, where hegemonic powers have become alarmingly barefaced with their now fully witnessed atrocities and suppression of human rights. It's important to take stock of where we are today on questions we have concerns about: the status of regional and international literacy, gender equity, wars of occupation, climate equity, and the myriad issues the world now faces. The Caribbean will do well with more leaders of conscience who understand that decolonization is not a historical flashpoint, but rather a deeper process of emancipation that each generation must respond to in the context of their time. I put it to you to consider the ways that you might move beyond spaces of physical and intellectual comfort, to move close enough to the injustices that you indict, not just to condemn them in abstraction, but to intimately understand the conditions of inequality, to step outside of the safety of thought, and to act, using your compass to find what love means for you.
Her grandfather would be proud of her. Thank you so much, Miss Rhea Manley. Thank you so much, and for touching on all of the important nodes that your grandfather spent much of his life working towards. Thank you again. Ladies and gentlemen, as we move on, I remember when we set about discussing the form that this conference would take, it was made very clear that it would be an academic conference and a non-partisan conference. So the involvement of members of the rival political party to Mr. Manley's PNP, the Jamaica Labour Party, is therefore welcome. And I am so happy to invite the Honorable Christopher Tufton, Dr. the Honorable Christopher Tufton, Minister of Health and Wellness, to bring his own remarks. Welcome, Dr. Tufton.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. And I must say I feel very lonely in this audience. But having said that, I have a lot of good friends in this audience also. Right, Principal?
Yes, sir.
Distinguished ladies and gentlemen, and please permit me to recognize our specially invited guest, the Honorable Jeremy Coburn. Good to have you, sir, and I hope your team wins tomorrow. Opposition Leader Mark Golding, good to see you, sir, and other members of the parliamentary group. I believe some senators are here. Principal Denzel Williams, good to see you again, Sir Hilary Beckles, and also Professor Bogues and his team. Members of the Manley family, ladies and gentlemen, one and all. First of all, I want to say that I am very pleased with this event. Because it's important, and I believe it was articulated by Professor Beckles and Principal Williams, that this is where it ought to be, the university campus, where ideas should contend, where conversations take place, and hopefully coming out of that, important lessons for this generation and for future generations. And so, if for no other reason, I think this is a worthy event, and I certainly wish the conversations that will take place over the next few days to be fruitful, and that coming out of these conversations will be a series of recommendations, if you will, as to how to proceed in terms of governance in a more positive way. I want to recall two cases of my interaction with Michael Manley. Yes, I am that young. I did interact with him at least on 2 occasions. The first time, I was the recipient while a first-year student here at the university, living on the best possible hall, Chancellor Hall. Yes. I was a recipient of the Jamaica Flour Mills Foundation Scholarship. And at the award ceremony in Michael Manley's constituency, East Kingston and Port Royal, I attended the ceremony, and I was privileged enough to give the vote of thanks on behalf of the recipients. And when I completed the vote of thanks, the room was quiet, and Michael stood up by himself and gave me what is the proverbial standing ovation. And then he came over and he shook my hand and commended me on the amazing speech I gave. It was a little 2-minute vote of thanks, but I felt like the most special person in the world. That is the power of the man. The second occasion was not that, well, let me give it to you. I went to watch him at a lecture at Georgetown University in Atlanta. I was there doing my master's at the time, myself and my cousin, Professor Evan Dugan, who was here up to recently. And he was giving a lecture, and I went to watch him. Very good lecture. And then afterwards, we were having a conversation. And I don't know if it was myself or Bunny who said to him, you know, this young man wants to go into the political arena, you know. And he said, oh, yes, man, I'm going to put him in touch with Tony Bogues to give him some advice. And I happened to say in a low-tone voice, I'm kind of interested in the other side. And his retort to me was, listen, I don't know nothing about them people, and so I can't help you there. And that's a true story. But, you know, you cannot help but liking and being interested in what Michael Manley had to say, because he was that much of a charismatic figure. And he made an impact on the audiences that he spoke on. My limited contribution today is more hopefully to be seen as an agitator than to conclude on any legacy of his leadership. I'm sure that will take course over the next couple of days. The period of time that Michael provided leadership at the level of Prime Minister, 1972 to 80 and 89 to 92, I'm hoping that the next few days will assess whether it was the same Michael Manley during those 2 periods. In other words, what he articulated and stood for in the first go-around and what he said in the second go-around were somewhat at variance if you were to dissect it in a significant way. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Beyond that, the question to my mind, and what I would love to get the experts to comment on, and hopefully out of the next couple of days, is whether or not leaders become victims of their circumstances, not their personal circumstances, but the environmental circumstances in which they exist. The challenges of the 70s were a different set of challenges of the late 80s and the early 1990s. I certainly believe so. And the perspective that had to be taken during both eras may have required a different approach. And hopefully a perspective would be shared on that in the coming days. There was the impact of the global environment, which Professor Williams spoke to earlier. And that global environment had a significant impact on the challenge of leadership during that period of time and what needed to be done. For starters, in the period of the 70s, the issues around self-identity and championing the rights of the citizens, whether from an education standpoint, from a social justice standpoint, there is no doubt that Michael Manley has to be credited for being a very strong advocate for that. And that was absolutely needed at the time. So he was the right man in the right place. And I'm sure a lot will be said on that. But at the same time, as we drew to the end of the period of the late 70s to 1980, the challenges that we faced at the time became almost untenable in terms of its impact on the country as a whole. Now, I know there are a lot of views around that, and I have not heard a view advocated, and maybe it has been said, but I have not heard it, and I wondered whether or not the deeper analysis could shed some light on that, as to whether or not in the era of the significant, should I say, uprisings, whether or not we were all victims of particular circumstances, meaning on both sides of the political divide. The arguments I've heard in that discourse is who was to be blamed, who was wrong, who pursued a particular course. But we existed in a context of an ideological divide that was driven largely by, for want of a better term, superpowers. And in many respects, they dictated the terms and condition of that divide. And I wondered whether or not there is a third philosophy that could emerge out of the analysis that says, in a way, we were all placed in a position where we were more takers of a direction than we were determinants of that direction. I could be wrong, but I said today, I'm coming here today as an agitator, not to conclude on these issues. And you have given me the opportunity to agitate, so I'm agitating. I would also ask whether or not the circumstances of where we reside as small island developing states, the Caribbean region, and the location of the Caribbean region to the main superpower, also played a role in how we were viewed by those who had the resources and the might to help to influence the agenda as it relates to the Caribbean. And one only has to look at Cuba and how Cuba has evolved. A lot of the policies around Cuba are not, if you were to think about them logically, they don't make sense, meaning the embargo at this point in time. Makes very little sense. But they are pursued. And the question is there a bigger picture at play than just that one mission of trying to punish one small island, one small country, relatively speaking, in terms of the position they hold because of the example that it may set for others? I believe in the earlier period, that may have been a bigger objective than certainly that it is now. And so I believe that the conversations around Michael's legacy is a good conversation to have. I believe that he can be credited and should be credited with significant advocacy, not just on the local stage for self-identity, free education, workers' rights, all the things that I know will come out over the next few days. I think he was also a big voice on the international platform. And he was listened to because he was charismatic and he said the right things, which may have also brought further attention to him and what he represented here within this small island space, because what he said mattered not just within country, but on a wider and a larger scale. And I think it's a conversation that we should all have. So that's my agitation for the evening. Not intended to be a long discourse, but to say that let the conversations take place, and I look forward to whatever proceedings may come from this. Thank you very much.
Minister, I don't know if there are agitations really, but as academics, these are the kinds of questions that we pose all the time for real discussion and debate. I just wanted to draw your attention to tomorrow's program. Since you asked, the questions you did, there's going to be a panel Between 2 and 3:30, it's Manly Nationalism, Social and Economic Justice. And there are two papers in particular, or presentations. One by Carl Watts, Economic Nationalism versus Economic Liberalism in Jamaica. That might be interested to you, 1970 to 93. And the other by Michael Witter, Case Study in Manly's Economic Strategy for Transformation, the Emergency Production Plan and the IMF Path. And then later on, there is the Political Roundtable, which Professor Brian Meeks will chair. And that's the panelists are Dr. Phillips and the Honorable Bruce Golding. So in those sessions, I suspect some of the answers to your agitation may actually be given. So I move on then so I am now very pleased to invite to the podium Mr. Mark Golding, President of the People's National Party and also Leader of the Opposition, to deliver his remarks.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ricketts, Madam Master of Ceremonies. I must acknowledge our guest from the UK and guest speaker, Honorable Jeremy Corbyn and Mrs. Corbyn. It's a pleasure to have you here in Jamaica again, sir. There's been a lot of protocol observing, and I'm tempted to adopt the protocols as observed. Should acknowledge my colleague parliamentarian, Dr. Tufton, who has a view, an agitating view of certain things, which is a good thing. And of course, I want to begin by congratulating Professor Tony Bogues and the other organizers of this inaugural Caribbean Prime Ministers Conference, which is in honor of Michael Manley, in anticipation of his upcoming 100th anniversary of his birth, and to the various institutional sponsors who have come together. I say it's a wonderful thing that has happened here today. I should acknowledge two important persons who are here, the Manley family and the representatives of the current generations who are with us, Sarah, Rhea and Maya, Joe, and of course, Beverly and Glyn Manley, Manley Duncan. There is no doubt. Oh, and there's one other acknowledgement. I just want to also acknowledge the representatives of the Cuban embassy who are here as well, who have not been acknowledged. There's no doubt that Michael Manley was a most consequential Caribbean political leader, and it is indeed fitting that the occasion of his centennial, upcoming septennial on the 10th of this month, has been the catalyst for the inauguration of a Caribbean Prime Ministers Conference series. It is my hope that this conference and the others to come in the future will provide timely opportunities for Caribbean intellectuals, students, and the wider public to celebrate and critique our region's political leaders, their achievements, their failings, as we seek to deepen our understanding of the region's modern political history and the forces that have shaped the choices we have made on our road to development. As the current president of the People's National Party, I stand on the shoulders of the 5 leaders who came before me, and I am fortunate to have had a personal relationship with 4 of those 5, the first of those 4 being Michael Manley, who I initially got to know as a teenager in the early 1880s when I was friendly, 1980s, a centennial out, when I was friendly with his then wife Beverly's niece, and I was a regular visitor to their home on Washington Close. And then later, in the 1990s, when having retired from politics, he was the principal consultant on the Government of Jamaica's Employee Share Ownership Plan program, ESOP program. And I was involved in the legal work to develop the ESOP legislation. We worked closely for a couple of years on that program. That happenstance meant that we met at least once a month on his veranda at Heathwood to discuss the ESOP program, but invariably the conversation would end up drifting into current affairs, as he would exhort persons of my generation, like me, to get involved in the political life of our country, and he was very passionate about that. And this was towards the end of his life, so some of those meetings he was in his light blue pajamas, but his passion never waned. I would never have imagined that one day I would be giving remarks in the capacity as the leader of the PNP at a conference in his honor. So life really is serendipitous. Michael Manley was a Jamaican Renaissance man, a passionate intellectual with a wide range of interests, including a deep love of sports, art, and music. His oratory and charm were unparalleled, and I believe it is safe to say that he is the most loved political leader that Jamaica has produced. With the benefit of hindsight, he's also increasingly recognized as a visionary leader whose ideas for creating a more fair and just society out of the cauldron of our colonial experience were often before their time. Michael Manley was courageous. He recognized that incremental adjustments to the status quo would not meet the needs and expectations of the majority of Jamaicans. And he was always willing to make bold steps towards the positive transformation of the society. During his first period as Prime Minister from 1972 to 1980, his policies and programs were developed through a democratic socialist ideological prism. This necessitated far-reaching changes to Jamaica's economy and society, which after a decade of independence, or political independence, had continued to be structured along classist, elitist, and race-configured colonial norms. Over the course of those 8 years, Jamaica was deeply transformed in profound ways never attempted, much less achieved, either before or since. The influence of Michael Manley's thought and mission reverberated across the region and made him a towering third world figure on the world stage. The backlash to this transformation that was instigated by the political representatives of the privileged status quo in Jamaica, aided by their external Cold War backers, was relentless and vicious, resulting in a concerted propaganda war against his government and this intensification of political violence as a tool of destabilization, which ultimately resulted in the bloody 1980 election defeat of the PNP. While a lot has been said and written about that period of our history, I would argue that much of the truth of what took place then remains unsaid, other than in private conversation. And such is the vestigial, unresolved impact of the deep divisions of that era on the nation's consciousness that there is no process at play for the truth to come out. So, Chris, I think your argument that we are driven by the context in which we live and the circumstances in which we live, and in the context of a small island like Jamaica or a region like the Caribbean, the world forces at play, the geopolitical forces at play, are sometimes greater than we are able to withstand, and we're constantly adjusting to that. I think it's a fair point. I wouldn't say we're victims of it, because to some extent they present opportunities as well. But in the 1970s, it played out in Jamaica in the Cold War era in a particularly vicious way. While that first 8-year period of Michael Manley's career in government generally attracts the most attention, and is often viewed nostalgically as the heyday of progressive achievement in Jamaica. His second period as Prime Minister was also very consequential. In fact, certainly in terms of economics, the latter period has had a more lasting impact than the first. Part 2 of Michael Manley in government established the basic economic model that Jamaica has been pursuing for the past 40 years. He recognized the leadership role of business in driving economic growth and was induced, persuaded, cajoled by the private sector in the context of the prevailing Washington consensus that had emerged, I suppose, out of the ending of the Cold War and the defeat of the left in Europe. He proceeded to rapidly liberalize the economy, removing exchange controls, eliminating price controls, and substantially getting rid of the licensing regimes for exports and imports. And this was done with the encouragement, as I've said, of the leaders of the private sector at the time. But it took Jamaica a long time to learn the rules and techniques of managing a small, open economy. I would therefore argue that the seeds of the past decades' debt reduction and other macro-fiscal successes that Jamaica is internationally recognized for were really sown by Michael Manley's bold reforms in part 2 of his government, which created the basic economic model that is prevailing and will prevail for some time. Though, as has been said, the inherent structural and other inconsistencies of that model necessitate further thought and further change. And the task of our times will be, how do we negotiate, identify and negotiate solutions for dealing with that within the context of the lessons that we have learned as an independent country so far. The unresolved challenge we face as a nation is how to move from macro-fiscal stability to inclusive, sustainable development that works for all Jamaicans. There is much in the teachings of Michael Manley, thankfully committed by him to writing in his many books and recorded speeches, that remains relevant to the task at hand. The principles of social justice and equality of access to opportunity, which Michael Manley steadfastly championed like no other throughout his life, must remain our guide in the search for solutions as we embark on yet another era of the politics of change. Thank you. I hope this conference will provide ample opportunities to expand and develop some of these ideas. One love.
Thank you very much again, Mr. Golding, and I am sure that over the next 2 days, some of the very issues which you have raised, and certainly the debate around the second phase of Michael Manley's leadership will also be discussed. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Ladies and gentlemen, we are delighted to have as our keynote speaker the Honorable Jeremy Corbyn, British politician and Member of Parliament. To introduce him will be our conference chair, Professor Anthony Bogues. But before I invite him to do so, I just wanted to share a very brief introduction of Professor Bogues. So Professor Bogues is a proud UWI alumnus. He's a Caribbean political theorist, intellectual historian, he's a writer and a curator. He is currently Professor of Africana Studies and the Director of the Ruth J. Simmons Center for the Study of Slavery and Justice at Brown University. And he's also a very distinguished visiting professor and curator at the Visual Identities in Art and Design Research Center at the University of Johannesburg. Earlier this year, he was awarded an honorary doctorate from the School of Oriental and African Studies, SOAS, the great SOAS, at the University of London. Ladies and gentlemen, I now invite Professor Bogues to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you very much, Dean. The Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences, Principal Denton Williams, Leader of the Opposition, Mr. Mark Golding, Minister of Health and Wellness, Dr. Christopher Tufton. I like that story that you told. The member of the Cuban embassy who's representing the ambassador here, all members of the Manley family, as well as other dignitaries. Welcome to this particular function. I also would like to pay special welcome to our special guest, Honorable Jeremy Corbyn, and his wife, Laura, Miss Laura Alvarez, who is the international coordinator of the Peace and Justice project. When the organizing committee began its search for a guest speaker for this conference, we had a list of names. And on the list was Jeremy Corbyn. There were, quite frankly, few names. The list was not extensive, because we were looking for somebody who would be ideologically close, we thought, to Michael Manley. Someone who, in this particular strange period of world politics, the beginnings of which Michael Manley began to discern, we said to ourselves that we needed someone who would have the courage to speak out. In other words, someone who would be, in the words of Michael Manley, and here I quote him, have the courage of his progressive political convictions. Honorable Jeremy Corbyn is such a figure. He has had a long career in British politics as a socialist and as a left political leader. In 1983, he was elected to the constituency of Islington North and has been in that constituency since then until this time. He was elected the leader of the British Labour Party between 2015 and 2020. And during that time, the party both transformed itself from a certain kind of Blairism, and also its membership grew exponentially. He represents, in my view, in British political life, a certain kind of tradition which draws from the 19th century British thinker, William Morris, as well as a certain kind of militant trade unionism and a certain kind of trend of or current of democratic socialism that was deeply influential on Michael Manley. And that current was headed by Harold Laski, the chairman of the British Labour Party. But he also has something else in his political makeup that I think is important, something that is very much missing, and we talked about this, from the British progressive politics, and that is a certain kind of progressive internationalism. Because Britain is an old colonial and still, quite frankly, imperial country. So it's very hard sometimes for those who are progressive or on the left to actually have a certain kind of internationalism. But Jeremy Corbyn has that internationalism. Given all of this, and in the midst of the ideological shifts over the gathering strength in the world, we thought that the Honorable Corbyn would be the ideal speaker. But there was also something that was plus in us making this decision. And that is, he was a member of the faculty of Kingston College in the late 1960s. And when I called him and asked him to be a speaker, don't think what he said to me was this: I will be delighted to do this I have one condition. And I thought to myself, okay, my mind began to work now. What else do we need to do? And he says, the only condition I have is that you prepare a visit for me to go to KC. And the Fortis people came today. I had to remind them that I come from the other side of the street, St. George's College. And I was reminded where Michael Holden came from. And a certain cricket match that was played in the 1970 between George's and Kingston College, of which I was a member of the St. George's College Sunlight cricket team at the time. So that what sealed the deal, in our view, was the business of KC and when we talked to KC folks, the real fond memories that they had of him. So we thought, okay, this really is the person we should invite. This morning he went to Kingston College, and from what he has said to me, he had a really remarkable visit. And Laura might be teaching Spanish beginning tomorrow morning in KC. Right. So, distinguished guests, for us, therefore, on the organizing committee, we could be not more pleased than to present to you all this evening the independent member of the constituency of Islington North, the Honorable Jeremy Corbyn, member of the British Parliament, a major world activist for peace, a spokesperson for the advocate of global rights and justice for all people. Honorable Corbyn.
Well, follow that. Thank you very, very much, and it's a great honor to me to be invited here today, and I want to thank Heather Ricketts for what she said at the beginning and the way she's conducted the opening parts of this, and it was wonderful to hear Hilary Beckles speak, albeit on a video link. And thank you, Professor Williams, for the work you do here and this wonderful university. And to Christopher Tufton, thank you so much for coming. Listen, football unites us all, and we disagree on every team. So we can all work together, and I think it's fantastic you're here, Dan. I was very interested in what you were saying about the historical process, and that's exactly what a university is for, to bring out that serious debate about studying the history that goes with it. And Mark Golding, thank you so much for being here today, and what you said about the 2 periods of Michael Manley's prime ministership, and again, the need to think about and study those things. And so it's been wonderful to be here, and thank you to the Social Services faculty, the P.J. Patterson Institute and Brown University for putting all this on. And Laura Alvarez, my wife, who's the international organizer for the Peace and Justice Project, myself, had an absolutely wonderful reception here. And I want to say what a pleasure and honor it is to meet more members of the Manley family. And I'm young enough to have met Michael Manley on 2 occasions. Once when I was very young here in Jamaica, I'll come on to that in a moment. But later on, when he was in Britain, and we had a public meeting in Tottenham, and amongst the guest speakers was the late Bernie Grant MP, and of course Jamaica's favourite daughter, Diane Abbott MP, was also there. The meeting was unbelievably chaotic, because large numbers of people in Tottenham all decided that it was necessary for them to speak also. So we had a platform of about 6 of us, plus Michael, and then a wannabe platform of about 30 who wanted to say something. But it was the warmth and the love there was for Michael from the, not just the Caribbean community in Tottenham. They wanted to be there to hear him and hear his contribution as a great Jamaican and what he had done so much in politics. And I want to say through you, thank you to Michael for his long life, wished it had been longer, and what he achieved in that life. As you know, Jamaica has a very special place in my life. I came here as a VSO, Voluntary Service Overseas volunteer, at the age of 18. I came into this very place here, and I was totally bowled over by the heat, the warmth, and everything else that went with it, until I discovered what I had to do. And they said, well, you're going to be a teacher in Kingston College. I said, fine, okay, fine, all right, so that's what it is. They said, you're going to teach geography, and I thought, fine, I've finished my geography studies and so on and so on. And I said, by the way, what sort of geography am I going to be teaching? They said, well, Caribbean geography. I said, yeah, okay. And so I said, yeah, okay, that sounds all right. So I asked for an advance of the textbook the students would be using, and they gave me one. I then left as quickly as I could, got the bus up towards Mona to here, went straight into Sangster's bookstore and said, what books have you got on Caribbean geography? So I bought the stock, went to my room and sat up all night reading them, and then worked out how I was going to work out a curriculum to teach the kids geography. The key with teaching is to always be one chapter ahead of the students. As long as you're a chapter ahead, you're okay. And if you get some really smart student who starts talking about the next chapter, you say, hang on a minute, that's for next week. Just control yourself, control your excitement for a bit. I also volunteered at Theatre 77 at the Barn with Trevor Rohn and Yvonne Jones, which was fantastic. My job was to operate the lights and serve the drinks at the interval, which wasn't very difficult because there was only two choices. It was either Appleton's rum or Red Stripe beer. It wasn't difficult. And as each person approached the bar, you just knew which they wanted. But, yeah, just intuition. So that was fine. And also here at Mona, I worked as a volunteer in the polio rehabilitation centre that was here as well. And I have to say, my time in Jamaica taught me far more than I ever taught anybody else. It taught me a love of the Caribbean and of Jamaica, but it also gave me a completely different view of the world, which Tony was referring to when he was talking just now, and started my lifelong interest in African and Caribbean and Latin American political history and political activities. So I owe Jamaica a great deal for everything that it taught me. But there was also acts of solidarity, which you sometimes don't always expect in most complicated circumstances. There are, I'm looking around, quite a few people in this audience that will have heard of Enoch Powell. Will some be old enough to remember the abominable speech he made on April the 20th, 1968, which was when he made that disgusting speech about migration to Britain is creating a situation where there's the rivers of blood will flow down our streets. It was a vile, disgusting speech designed to stoke up racism, to stoke up division and everything else. And obviously this was well known all over the world. And after a day in school, I went over to the bus stop. I went down North Street and went to the bus stop and sat there waiting to catch the bus to go back home. And a group of boys came up to me and sort of looked at me and said, what are you doing here? I sort of said, well, what's it look like I'm doing? I'm at a bus stop. I'm waiting for a bus. It's what people do. And they said, no, you've got to be careful. And these boys had really given me a very hard time all that day in school. And they were very lucky, and this is serendipitous. I didn't put all three of them in detention because they deserved it. They really, truly did. And they said, so I said, okay. They said, look, we're here to take you home because we're worried that bad things might happen to you tonight because of the anger people have got about what Powell had said. I didn't realize they were that conscious about what was going on the news, and I didn't realize what a wonderful, generous act that was to say they were worried about me and they wanted to take me home to make sure I was okay. So if those boys are still around, thank you very much for what you did on that occasion. So I want to talk about Michael. If I could just read a quote from Michael, and listen carefully. We know what capitalism and colonialism has meant for us, and we are not for sale. and tell them any time they're willing to deal with an honourable Jamaica built on principle, sovereignty, pride and dignity, then we will take the investment of the money. But are we to return to our knees? They can keep the money, we will find another way. That was the defiance of Michael at the height of all of the problems that Jamaica was going through. And what it does is sets out Michael's legacy in the struggle against colonialism. And then he became Prime Minister. This was after I'd left Jamaica at that time. And his election was a huge political shift, obviously. His style of doing things was an enormous political shift. And he had this wonderful charisma about him, which is back to the Tottenham meeting. People just wanted to see him, wanted to hear him, because they knew what a tough time he'd been through. And remember, this was well after he had been through the problems of his first time in office. But the significant shift that he brought, just think about some of the things he introduced. Minimum wage, compulsory recognition of trade unions, free school meals program, increase in pensions, maternity leave, equal pay for women, Children's Act, which granted equal status to children born out of unwed parents. And that's the very important point that Heather was making at the beginning. Now, looking back, and you think, well, why on earth would you need even to legislate to do that? It's so obvious that every child should be treated equally. But sadly, it doesn't always happen. Even in my country, we have a benefit system that doesn't give child benefits to the children in larger families. It's disgusting. So well done, Michael, on recognising the need to treat all children decently and equally. He also established the Jamaican movement for the advancement of literacy and for free secondary and tertiary education, and expanding and opening rural health centres, National Housing Trust, to build housing for working class people, and pooled the funds for loans for reasonable rates for building as well. So he had this vision of redistribution of ownership and power in what was a very divided society. It was the descendant of the British colonial system and British colonial rule that had gone on for all those hundreds of years. But his philosophy was also about empowering of people. And it wasn't just his speeches in Parliament and elsewhere that he made. It was that he established mechanisms to engage young people by reducing the voting age to 18, and he did have enormous support amongst young people. And I think it's the legacy of Michael that we need to think about, how he managed to develop the very progressive policies that he did, but also that he set up the youth program led by Senator Miller, which was to set up youth councils around the country. And those councils were designed to empower young people and give them a say. And it's not that young people don't have any opinions on politics. It's too often the problem that politics doesn't have any interest or care about young people, and their voices are too often unheard in the political system. Young people, it's their future. We're building for the next generation, not the last generation. So let's get that message out there. And it was a hopeful time, and he then had enormous opposition up against him. Actually, both parties recognised the enormous opposition that Michael suffered was internally, politically, was internally within his own party at times. Tell me about that. I know that. I'll give you another lecture on that another time, all right? That's for another day. But he also had very, very powerful enemies outside of Jamaica. And that was because nobody in the powerful echelons of Western Europe or the Western Hemisphere wanted to see Jamaica becoming a socialist country, and didn't want to see someone like Michael Manley having this huge leadership figure across the whole non-aligned world. His was an enormous contribution, way out of proportion to the size of Jamaica. His influence extended so far. And what was so impressive of his life was the way that that influence extended globally, and he never ever forgot the roots of where he came from, the roots of the support for him and his party in Jamaica. So he initially resisted the IMF reform packages. And remember, the IMF had some, the IMF and its role in structural adjustment programs, its role in imposing great burdens and imposing austerity economics on country after country, and the way in which the World Bank had also operated and brought in the whole monetarist philosophy which Thatcher and Reagan put forward. So Michael was in a period when philosophically the right thought they were in the ascendancy through the Friedman School of Economics, the Chicago School, which was so devastating for the people of Chile, and the structural adjustment programs that were so devastating for public services all across Latin America and all across Africa. Michael offered an alternative way in his determination on achieving a new international economic order. And so he did have a very hard time and a very difficult time ahead of him. He was forced eventually in the second term to accept IMF loans and the conditions that went with them. And so his legacy is going to be debated over these 3 or 4 days here, which is very, very important to do it. But I want to put it in the context. He'd become the Prime Minister of a Caribbean island that had enormous gap between the richest and the poorest, a colonial legacy on its industrial structure, the need for growth, the need for more money to invest in public services. And instead of getting the support and safe passage that could have been offered by the international financial institutions, instead it was unremitting hostility to him because they didn't want that example. So let's remember Michael as the man who wanted justice and equality for all of the people of Jamaica. He was also important on the international stage in many ways. His opposition to the apartheid regime in South Africa was absolute, complete and total. These days, I can't meet anybody anywhere in the world at any time, even the most right-wing Tory MPs in Britain, who weren't apparently all part of the anti-apartheid movement. Apparently they were all there. Now, I was on every anti-apartheid demonstration there ever was, and lots of meetings there was, and funnily enough, I just don't quite remember them being there at the time. And when Nelson Mandela came to speak in Parliament when he had been freed and eventually was elected president of South Africa, the first time he came, he gave quite a long talk, and gradually the attention span of the MPs diminished and diminished and diminished, and they all sort of disappeared. They all said, got an important meeting, very important meeting to go to. And the only people left in the room were Tony Benn, me, and Nelson Mandela. So Nelson said, well, there's no need for us to be on the platform. So he pulled up a table and we just sat down and had a chat together, the three of us. The most memorable time of my life was that half an hour or so with Nelson Mandela talking about how he would economically restructure South Africa. But at that time, in the 60s, opposition to apartheid was limited. It was limited to the bravery of the frontline states. It was limited to those people that were conscious enough to go out and protest about it around the world. And acts of solidarity were very, very important. And so when the South African regime invaded Angola in order to remove the FMLN government there, and Cuba, to its eternal credit, wanted to support the Angolans and obviously oppose the apartheid regime, Michael came to the fore to say that Jamaica would be part of that by allowing Cuban planes to land in Jamaica on their way there, and also, for that matter, in Barbados. And I think we should remember that. And this was Michael trying to overcome the legacy of so much that Jamaica had suffered. Now, I want to say, if I may, something about history and the slave trade and all that goes with it. Too often in Britain, when you talk about the slave trade or slavery in schools, it's always reduced to one lesson, and it always ends up chatting about William Wilberforce. Now, William Wilberforce, I'm sure, was a very nice man, and he did introduce the bill in Parliament which ended the slave trade and eventually ended slavery, which had always actually been illegal in Britain, as I'm sure you're as well aware as I am. But it is never talked about in the way in which it ought to be about the role Britain played in establishing the slave trade and the wealth that Britain received from the slave trade. And that is what I want to talk about. Wilberforce may well have been a benevolent, nice man. That's not the point. The point is the historical process that went on with it. The narratives are important. Long before the Abolition Act, a number of enslaved people led slave rebellions. And those slave rebellions were brave, were heroic, and were horrendously put down. We went to Emancipation Park today, Lara and myself, and just looked at the history there of Sharp, of Paul Bogle, and of all the other leaders. And it's one of the joy of my life was to know Richard Hart very well and his wonderful book that he wrote about all of this. The real reason that the Slavery Abolition Act went through and the Slave Trade Abolition Act went through was because of the uprisings in Morant Bay and the ones in the west of Jamaica, ruined the sugar trade, caused economic problems for the very powerful sugar owners, and that led to a change in attitude. And the Great Slave Revolt of 1831, 1832 was only 2 years before the Abolition Act went through. It lasted 11 days and 60,000 people, enslaved people, took part in that rising. 500 were killed, and the leader, Sam Sharp, was captured, put on trial and executed, and his dying words were, "I would rather die upon yonder gallows than live in slavery." His role in history might be contested, and often historical debates can become quite complicated, but he did help through his death to bring about the end of slavery. And those voices couldn't be ignored, and so we then came to the point when the abolition actually took place. And in his book, Richard Hart says, in this book, Slaves Who Abolished Slavery, Blacks in Rebellion, he emphasised that enslaved people in Jamaica fundamentally changed the agenda and forced the British government to act and gained their freedom. Why, we got a problem with microphones? Let's try this one in here then. What do you got? Can it go in there? No, it's going to have to go in there. We've got stereo. And so I want to just ask you to think very carefully about that. Britain took over Jamaica in 1655, and it took until the mid-19th century before slavery was abolished, and it then took until 1962 before independence was achieved. And the academic Michael Lemonis, in his works, describes and says, the British Empire began its colonial role in Jamaica with the immediate control and division of land, the enslavement of indigenous African and Caribbean people for plantation labor, nationalism, trauma, divide and rule policies, religious suppression, and all forms of violence imaginable to man. And it was because of the wealth of Jamaica, because of the sugar cane, it became the wealthiest of all British colonies all over the world. And it was seen as the most incredibly rich place in which to be. And indeed, Elizabeth Barrett Browning, who wrote that incredible poem, The Runaway Slave from Pilgrim's Point, came to Jamaica as a child. Her parents were very wealthy people from Yorkshire in the north of England, and indeed were part of the slave industry. She came here as a child, was disgusted by it, and went back home and then started arguing with her parents about it and joined the Anti-Slavery League in Britain. And her parents gave her an ultimatum: leave your campaigning against slavery or get out of the house. So she left the house, never went back, never spoke to them again, and died in great poverty, gave her life to the anti-slavery cause, and wrote that amazing poem. And she was a white woman who wrote this actually very wonderful poem about it, as did many, many other poets. So I think we should remember those people. but also remember those that have done so much to study and bring to reality the amount of money that was made out of the slave trade. Eric Williams, the first Prime Minister of independent Trinidad and Tobago, in that wonderful book, Capitalism and Slavery, said, "Strange that an article like sugar, so sweet and necessary to human existence, should have occasioned such crimes and such bloodshed." And so the post-slavery society is what we then have to look at. So when slavery ended, the British needed a new means of enforcing the social order. The end of slavery only came with the Abolition Act that happened, and this then meant there had to be changes which included wage labour and the installation of certain values which made it socially unacceptable for women to work. Jamaica, by the time of its formal independence in 1962, was still a society that was dominated by the structures it had inherited from the end of the slave trade itself. And that was a time, the early 1960s, of enormous intellectual progress and thought about how post-colonial societies would develop. Ghana had only been independent 5 years, many of the French colonies in West Africa about the same, and other British colonies. And Aimé Césaire wrote at the time, "The colonial enterprise is to the modern world what Roman imperialism was to the ancient world, the prelude to disaster and the forerunner of catastrophe." And so it is those issues that we have to address. And the legacy in Jamaica is still here. Manly had to contend with the inequalities and injustice, had to contend with the levels of indebtedness of Jamaica because of the unequal economic system that was there, and the social attitudes and all that went with it. And my time here in the 1960s was really quite incredible, because that was the beginning of the growth of black consciousness movements. I remember Walter Rodney arriving in Jamaica, coming here to give a lecture, which was then banned by the government, and he was then removed from Jamaica. And this was at the time he wrote his incredible book on how Europe underdeveloped Africa. And that was the time of that whole firmament of it. Which then leads on to, here we are now, 50 years later, there is the most grotesque levels of inequality in the world, which means we've got to start facing up to the issue of the wealth that was dragged out of colonies in the Caribbean, in Latin America, and in Africa, which made companies, organizations, and individuals incredibly rich in Western Europe. So the issue of reparations has to be faced up to. We can't walk away from it. But then Britain did make reparations in 1833, very generous reparations. Unfortunately, they didn't go to the slaves who had been enslaved and murdered and brutalized and killed in their thousands, even on the journey, where the bodies were thrown off the ships in order to avoid an insurance claim. Britain instead paid what was a stupendous amount of money in 1833 of £20 million in compensation to the slave owners because of their loss of their ownership of slaves. Many of those slave owners were actually members of Parliament alongside William Wilberforce. To put it in its context, that was 40% of all British government expenditure at that time. So in other words, almost half of all expenditure of government they were prepared to pay out in compensation to slave owners because they felt they deserved it. And then you have to ask yourself the question, where did all this money go? It wasn't until 2015 that the debt incurred by the British government by paying off the slave owners was finally paid off. In today's sums, it would be £300 billion that was paid in compensation to slave owners. Not one slave received one halfpenny for the horrors that they went through. They only received relative freedom and the ability not to be a slave. They still had to work, they were still living in poverty, and they were still subject to the vagaries of the economic system in the world. And the numbers of institutions and individuals in Britain that have benefited from that compensation is still there, including the Church of England, including many universities. To their credit, Glasgow University has recognised its duty to repay that money by supporting institutions in other parts of the world. The British Museum is constantly under pressure about returning artefacts. So the debate is a very real one. Former Prime Minister of Britain, David Cameron, who himself, his family had benefited from the compensation, came here, as you remember, in 2015 and said that what he would like to do is offer to build Jamaica a new prison so that the prisoners who are Jamaican prisoners in British prisons could be housed here. Well, to call it an insult is a bit of an understatement. I think we need to have a serious examination of how we can promote the whole argument about bringing justice, not just to the individuals, but to the countries and the societies that were so impoverished by slavery when they themselves were very, very rich places. And so maybe it's the beginning of a new approach that we need to have. But I'm quite cautious about this because in October of this year, the current British Prime Minister said that he wanted to avoid a long and endless discussion about the past and focus instead on the current future-facing challenges. Well, easy words to say, but it doesn't cut it when you're dealing with the issues of global inequality and the responsibilities for those. And so I do think we need to have that very, very serious discussion about it. And so when the Foreign Secretary also said, this is not the debate that people are wanting to have, okay, he said that at the Commonwealth Heads of Government Conference in Samoa last month. What he seems to have ignored is that 56 other Commonwealth heads of government said they did want to have that discussion and did want to have that debate and wanted to promote that debate. And so I think it's time that we actually did that. The reparations agenda didn't start with the debates of the last couple of years. It goes back to the first Pan-African Conference of 1900 and again in the historic one at Chawton-cum-Hardy Town Hall in Manchester in 1945 when many of the later leaders of African and Caribbean countries were all there under one roof talking about the future of the world and the post-colonial world that goes with it. I spoke earlier today, or last week rather, to my friend Remy Capo, who's a writer who has written a trilogy of books about the slave trade, which is thinly veiled, based in Jamaica, but he calls it something different in the book. They're novels that he's written, but they're totally brilliant. And what he said to me was, and I'll read it, the European nations, especially Britain, better make themselves aware now that my generation, the next generation, and the oncoming generations in Africa and the Caribbean will never, ever cease to call for reparations and for the return of artifacts. They will keep making this demand for hundreds of years, if that's how long it takes. Prime Ministers and Foreign Secretaries may find themselves taking a position to suit their national agenda here and now, but they will find themselves on the wrong side of history. And so those who insist that reparations about the past need to explain today how it is that the world's richest 1% own half of the wealth of all of the globe. We're living in an age of global inequality. That's what Michael stood up against. That's what we all equality. And so let's think about how we can look at these issues and look at the injustices that are still continuing to happen in Britain. I represent, and I'm very proud to represent, a constituency where there are over 70 different languages spoken. There are people who come from all over the world, and I'm very proud to have been elected to represent it on 11 successive occasions, the last time as an independent. And many of my, my constituents have suffered from the Windrush scandal. The Windrush scandal was unbelievably disgraceful thing. And it was, everybody could have seen it coming. Strangely, in 2014, when the issue came up in Parliament about the regulation changes which would mean that existing migrants to Britain from mainly the Caribbean, but also from Africa and some from Asia, would no longer have a right of permanent residence in Britain, even though they'd been there 40, 50 years, worked in the health service, worked on the buses, worked on the trains, teachers and everything else. They knew what was coming. Only 6 Labour MPs, including Diane Abbott, John McDonnell and myself, voted against it, and only a small number actually spoke out against it at the time. Those people that came to Britain in the Windrush in 1948 and those that came in the 1950s endured the most disgusting racism in society. It's there in Andrea Levy's book, also lived in my constituency and wrote the book about that whole area. They suffered. They suffered racism, they suffered abuse, they suffered bad housing, they suffered poor wages, and they suffered a lack of support. It was only the bravery of people that took part in things like the Bristol bus boycott in 1959, that stood up against the fascists in Notting Hill in 1958, and stood up against the National Front later on, that began to change the agenda. And so, in my constituency, I'm very proud that we've got a statue put up by Nubian Jack, which is in honour of all the Caribbean workers and the Irish workers that came to Britain and worked in our hospital, the Whittington Hospital. And this was put up because we wanted to do it, but it was also about giving a history lesson and an understanding to the wider population of the importance and how Britain has benefited from the migration of people from Jamaica and all of the other islands that have done so much to develop our health service, our education service, and so many other things. And I just want to say thank you to all of them for the contribution they've made to our society. And A.C. Van Anden famously said about migration, "We're here because you were there." The Windrush generation migrated from countries decimated by colonial rule. They were lured by a promise that wasn't fulfilled of a better life. Instead, they were used for cheap labour. But they've also made a huge contribution to the politics of it. And it is people like Professor Gus John, Grenadian-born scholar, who told me that more and more Jamaicans living in the UK were going back to Jamaica, but soon realised they couldn't stay for too long. The reason being that they wanted to be able to continue to receive help and support from the National Health Service because of the problems of private medicine, not just in Jamaica or the other islands as well. But I'm not here blaming the Jamaican government and certainly not blaming the Minister of Health. I realise the problems you're up against. I realise the issues of expenditure, and I realise the need of demand. And so there has to be a much fairer treatment of Jamaica and all of the other Caribbean islands in the development agenda they're putting. David Cameron offering to build a prison isn't good enough and won't cut it. And so we need something better and something different. But there are the other issues that have to be addressed, and that is attitudes towards empire, towards history and colonialism. David Cameron, the one who offered you the prison, also went on to say that to the British public, we should be proud of our empire and that we should stop apologising for our imperial past. Boris Johnson went a bit further, and he said that when asked about Africa's problems, he said the problems are that we are not in charge anymore. And those attitudes haven't gone away. 2 weeks ago in the British Parliament, the issue of the Chagos Islands came up, and the right of the Chagosian people to return to the islands and the legal right of Mauritius to resume control of the islands as a process of decolonization. And so I made the point that I didn't want Britain to go back to the days of colonial empire when we'd be sending a gunboat to sort out the problem on the Chagos Islands, and that we'd moved on from being an imperial power. And the people in front of me, the reformed group of MPs led by Nigel Farage, said, oh, yes, we are. We're going back to the colonial era. That is the future that the far right in British politics are offering at the present time. They're offering petty nationalism, the images of empire and the images of power, rather than understanding the historical process that's gone with it. Things have changed, but they need to change a lot more. Dawn Butler and myself, when we were in charge of these things in the Labour Party, established the Emancipation Education Trust as a way of putting into every school in our country the real history of empire, colony, exploitation and slavery. And I'm determined that that will still be achieved. We need to do far more to understand what history is really about. Too many of young people in our country, particularly in primary and the early years of secondary school, do not receive, in my view, a sufficiently global history. And I do think we need to have a greater movement all around the world for global teaching of history. Having Black History Month, once a year, isn't good enough. We need that to be centrally in the curriculum from the very beginning. Both what happened, what the uprisings were about, and what the history was really about. And so reparations are about truth, are about justice. And if we're to get that political debate in Britain and in Europe, which is serious about reparations and serious about a new international economic order, there has to be a far greater understanding of the history of the world. And our young people, all being brought up understanding that the great sciences, the great discoveries, the great inventions didn't all come from Europe. They came from Africa, they came from Latin America, they came from Asia, they came from China. We have to have a global understanding of where our knowledge and our literature and our joys come from. And so I just want to put it this way, that the legacy of slavery is still there. It's still there in inequality and injustice in the places that suffered from slavery. It's still there in the inequality and injustices of the countries that benefited so much. And that history needs to be challenged. You can walk around any English or Scottish or Welsh city and you see the names of slave owners up there on the street signs. And so the Colston issue in Bristol was just one example of a growing movement of people that wanted to see and do things differently and understand where all that wealth came from. It's the same all over the country with the work that was done by Irish workers as well as by those that came and made their homes. And so in the last part I want to say is this. It is about reparations, yes, but it's also about the need to develop a new economic order. Britain is the 6th largest economy in the world, yet it needs to change. There are 4.3 million children living in poverty, 250,000 people are homeless, and we have more billionaires than ever. And that grotesque levels of inequality have got worse. And that inequality is hardwired in to a free market economic system that somehow or other says economic and political progress is when you get people who are very rich. It's also backed up by a media process which extols the virtue of massive levels of individual wealth as though that is a great achievement for all of us. Well, it's great to see pictures of people driving around in great big limousines, always white, by the way, always big white limousines, always painted white. I don't know why. And we're all supposed to admire that. Okay, fine, lovely car, great, get on with it. But I'm much more concerned about the number of children that are not getting to school because they can't afford it. Parents who can't put their kids through secondary school because there are charges involved with it. And the numbers of young people all over the world who simply can only dream about going to university because it's not for them. Surely we need to have a process where the basic needs of people are met. security is really the ability to eat, your children to be in school, to have a hospital and a doctor to go to, and a secure roof over your head. Surely those are the things that we should be striving for, and that is so much of what Michael was trying to do when he was leader of the PNP and Prime Minister of Jamaica. So those are the issues that face us. The great issue of the time is, of course, climate change and the need to address the issues of climate change. The poorest 50% of the population are responsible for just 12% of global emissions, but are exposed to 75% of the economic losses. It's the poorest people in the poorest countries, in the most vulnerable places, that are suffering the most in poor quality air, soil erosion, rising sea levels, and extreme weather patterns. And so we do have to address the issues of how we deal with climate change. And all the COP conferences, every one of them comes out with the idea, yes, we'll set up a new fund. Not one of those funds has been fully met yet. Every time the offers are made, they're not actually delivered at the end of it. And your recent experience with Hurricane Beryl was that it caused you $67 million worth of damage at least. And this is going to go on and on all around the world and get worse and worse. Therefore, we have to reduce emissions. Therefore, we have to stop the destruction of the biodiversity on which all of us need to survive, and start being much more serious about sustainable methods of energy production and energy usage. And the technological inequality between the southern countries and Western Europe and the United States is enormous. That's why global funds, reparations, investment, fairness, decent terms of trade are important, not just for themselves in social justice, but also important in dealing with the issue of extreme climate change. And in his book, Michael talked a lot about this, and he talked about, in the book, Up the Down Escalator. Some people think countries like Jamaica are always moving upwards. And then in his book, he describes very carefully how the escalator was actually really going the other way, and the whole thing was an illusion. He was calling for a new international economic order, now usually referred to as a new global economic order, being promoted by many people around the world, including Progressive International, which I'm part of. And so it is about empowering countries and communities in how we begin. Looking at cancelling the debts of the global south, which are so enormous and unpayable. Look at the problems of your neighbour, Haiti, born into debt when the independence movement won and defeated the French colonialists, never been out of debt since then. That debt has changed hands a few times, but the brutality of the debt collectors has never changed in the 200 years of its existence. And so there has to be a global movement towards debt relief. And that is what Michael was pushing for very hard. I remember those days very well when he was working with my friend Judith Hart, who was Secretary of State for International Development at the time, on innovative ideas such as a global wealth tax, and pushing to a global treaty which would bring in a minimal level of corporation tax to begin to curtail the powers of global corporations who pay ducks and drakes with the individual economies all over. So getting the richest to pay just 1%, the richest 1% to pay 0.5% extra tax on the wealth over the next their wealth over the next 10 years would equal the investment needed to create 117 million jobs all across the world. It overlaps with another key ongoing solution about building global solidarity movements. It's not just about economic theories, it's not just about the valuable work we do in universities like this. And I'll get my papers back and finish my speech. Thank you very much. I wanted, as Labour leader, to be part of a process where we develop stronger international social orders. That means the importance of international trade union cooperation. There is trade unions, yes, exist all over the world. In many cases, trade union membership is in decline as manufacturing industry is in decline, and in some cases also in decline because of loss of jobs in the public sector. The growth areas, the gig economy, where many people are grotesquely employed, often have no trade union protection whatsoever, no workers' rights protection at all, no rights of work whatsoever. There is a whole generation all over the world that are being abominably exploited through the gig economy, and that is something that needs to change. And through the Peace and Justice Project and through Progressive International, we are trying to do something about that. Michael worked in a time when there was the Cold War was in full swing, particularly during the first period in office, and he received unbelievable levels of hostility from global institutions. And it was his desire to put forward an alternative to the US control and hegemony that was there, and to work with the non-aligned movement and to bring people together all across the Caribbean. He was well ahead of his time in so many ways. And at the BRICS summit this year, Antonio Guterres said something that Michael himself could have said. He said, "No single group and no single country can act alone or in isolation. It takes a community of nations working as one global family to address the global challenges." And he went on to say, and this is where the global challenges are hooed, we need peace in Gaza, we need peace in Lebanon, we need peace in Ukraine, we need peace in Sudan. Everywhere we must uphold the values of the UN Charter, the rule of law, and the principles of sovereignty, territorial integrity, global independence of all states. And by and large, the leaders of the Global South do understand that and have shown their solidarity with the Palestinian people. And I was at the demonstration in London on Saturday, the 22nd demonstration we've held in London in support of the Palestinian people. And I just cannot fail to be moved by the words of Palestinian people speaking about what they're going through at the moment. We're watching in real time, on real television, genocidal acts taking place in Gaza as children are being killed. 45,000 people have already died. And I've made the demand, and will continue to, that the European countries stop all arms supplies to Israel and end the occupation of Palestine to bring about peace for the people there. And that means a global arms embargo. So it is about the thirst for peace in Ukraine as well as in Sudan, as well as in Yemen, as well as in the other conflicts in the world. We need a world not based on war, not spending $2.4 trillion a year on arms. We need a world that looks at the injustices, the global injustices that go with it, and tries to bring about some real changes in that. That's what Michael tried to do in his life. And so, in conclusion, I just say this. It is about giving voice to people. It is about giving people hope. It is about standing up against the richest and the powerful. Too often, our voices are demeaned. The voice of young people is demeaned. The voice of the marginalized in society is demeaned. And what Michael did in his life was to give huge levels of hope to young people. It's a very precious commodity. You can't measure it. You know it when you see it. When it's not there, you know it's not there as well. So it is about hope. And hope comes from inspiration and from music and from art and from economic and political ideas. And that's what this 3 days here is so important about. It's discussing the legacy, discussing the issues, discussing the hope. And the Caribbean has produced many, many wonderful poets, and I want to just read a section from Camus Brathwaite's Islands. Looking through a map of the Antilles, you see how time has trapped its humble servants here, descendants of the slave. Do not lie in the lap of the more fortunate gods. The rat in the warehouse is as much king as the sugar he plunders. But if your eyes are kinder, you will observe butterflies, how they fly higher and higher before their hope dries, with endeavour, and they fall among the flies. The great poets of the Caribbean, the great artists of the Caribbean, those that stood up against slavery, those that achieved independence, and those that are still standing for global justice, peace and equality. Thank you very much, and thank you for the honour of inviting me here today.
That's okay. This has been a real treat. Let's, give another round of applause. Thank you so much, MP Corbyn. And your summary of Michael Manley, giving voice, hope, and standing up for justice, truth, and equality. I think those words sum him up quite well. I quite liked as well the tracing of the slave trade all the way back to the period of colonialism and independence, the period at which we became independent nations in the Caribbean, and the state of the economy and the society. And for prime ministers such as Michael Manley and other prime ministers who inherited that kind of legacy of slavery and colonialism, the work that they had to do to bring justice and equality to their societies. Thank you so much. Thank you. So as I close, I just want to say that I think that the stage has been well set for the next 2 days, and what I expect to be a very rich discourse and very rich debate, which we will have. I want to thank the Vice Chancellor, Professor Sir Hilary Beckles, Principal Williams, Professor Tony Bogues, and the entire Conference Planning Committee. Also our Marketing and Communications Office, UWITV, and all who worked to ensure this very successful opening ceremony. And of course, to all of you who are here for joining us this evening. I couldn't leave before, or close before just reminding you that the conference starts in earnest tomorrow. It begins at 9:30 in this direction. So to my right, just behind this building is the Social Sciences Lecture Theatre. And that's where we will meet for the next 2 days. We invite you to return to the campus tomorrow. Those of you who can, if you can come for the 2 days. It is free. It is open to all. And as I said, it's just a stone's throw away. Some of the panels that I have been asked to just highlight, and I don't want to, and I'm doing this at the risk of, thinking that you thinking that I might be diminishing some panels, but certainly the Gender Justice and Decolonization Roundtable tomorrow at 3:30 to 5, and that's dedicated to Joan French, Beverly Manley Duncan, and Lynette Vassell. Hi Lynette, I see Lynette here. Nice to see you. And the panelists will be Peggy Antrobus, Tracy Robinson, and Khadija Williams. There's also the roundtable. Panelists being Dr. Peter Phillips and the Honorable Bruce Golding, and that will be moderated by Professor Brian Meeks. That's at 5:30 to 7:30 tomorrow. And then on Thursday, there are personal reflections on Michael Manley, which begin from 11 to 12:30, and then again from 2:30 to 3. And I see some people in the audience. I'm sure I saw Bunny Witter. Yes, he's sitting, around the back in his Kariba suit. I think I also saw Rosie MacDonald. Where's Rosie? Rosie was here, former superintendent of police, and I believe former Prime Minister Manley's personal security. Yes. Did I see former mayor of Spanish Town, Miss Jennifer Edwards? I thought I saw her in the audience. So those personal reflections, and then of course there are the there are the closing reflections by Mrs. Glyn Manley, and that's 4 to 4:30 tomorrow. There's an interview with Manley Duncan, and Professor Tony Bogues, and that's 2 to 3:30 on Thursday. And the closing ceremony, of course, the keynote speaker will be the Most Honorable P.J. Patterson, statesman in residence. So, colleagues, friends, ladies, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, we have come to the end of what I think has been a really very rich opening ceremony. I look forward to the next 2 days. We're asking you, urging you to repair back here tomorrow morning and onward onto Thursday. Thank you so much again, MP Corbyn and Ms. Alvarez. Thank you so much for agreeing to be our guest speaker and our very special guest. Thank you again to the Manley family. Thank you, Ria. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. We now invite you